Welcome to the AccessTruth Podcast, exploring challenging issues currently impacting missions in a rapidly changing world. The AccessTruth Podcast with Paul Mack.
Well, I'm very privileged today to be talking with Tom Steffen. Dr. Tom Steffen is an author and Professor Emeritus of Intercultural Studies at Biola University, author of, among many other books, Passing the Baton and the Facilitator Era, Worldview-Based Storying, and most recently co-authoring with William Biola, The Return of Oral Hermeneutics. So glad to be able to talk today with you, Tom. I appreciate you taking the time with us.
It's great, and I thank you for the invitation, Paul.
Well, I wonder if we could start, for those who don't know you, Tom, who would, if you'd be willing just to describe just briefly your personal journey and your history. And I guess what I'm most interested in is the progression of your own thinking that's fed into your teaching and your writing, and how that's progressed through the years. How did that start and progress to where you're at in that today?
Yeah, we ended up in the Philippines. We're New Tribes Mission, now Ethnos 360, and an SIL couple, actually from my home denomination, invited us to come and do the church planning with them up in Luzon, the main island there, among the Antipolo, Amduntu, Gifugao. And so that's what we did. We ended up there. And that's where I started learning that what I knew wasn't always what the Ifugao wanted to know, or how it was presented and how they learn and stuff like that. They put me on a learning path that, and that's where I am today. One of the things I found out, and right off the bat, was within NTM, New Tribes Mission, they didn't have an exit strategy. And so that's one of the things that we talked with the field chair at that point and tried to come up with one. And that's where Passing the Baton would actually come out of that. So that we actually had an exit strategy, because for almost 20 years in the Philippines, there was none. Another thing is we started into evangelism. I started realizing my propositional approach was going nowhere. And so it was like, okay, you know, you can teach them how to do propositions, or you can learn how they learn. And so it was back to the drawing board. And I realized, you know what, I'm going to try stories here. And so I decided the next time we were out at Baguio, and I went to the Bible bookstore and bought some little children's Bible story books. And I came back and I pasted key Kalei words, their language, on the bottom of there. And I started teaching these Bible stories. And all of a sudden, you know, grandma and grandpa and kids and anybody in between, they were telling these stories all over the place. I'm like, oh my, what have I stumbled onto here? It's like, why didn't I know this? You know, it's like, where have I been? And where have my teachers been? Why didn't I know this before I got here? And so that launched me on the whole thing of trying to come up with stories of how to approach it. And so we actually put some things together. And I really didn't have a good model, though, of how to tie it all together. And that's when I had conversations with Trevor McElwain, and he's telling me about what was going on down on the island of Palawan among the Palawanos. And I'm thinking, there's the model that I can put my story into. And now I have a framework in which to approach it. And so that was the beginning of my journey on that. Out of that book would come Reconnecting God's Story to Ministry. And because I started a class on it then at Biola. And I thought, well, if you're going to, I wanted a textbook that kind of covered some of the things I wanted to cover. And then a second book that came out of that was Business as Usual in the Missions World, a big question mark. But I did it in story format. I'd never written a story. I'm thinking, if you're going to teach in story and tell everybody, tell stories, write a book in story. We didn't do that with Oral Hermeneutics, but we did it with the Facilitator area and the Business as Mission book. that first book was so difficult to write, to try to get your mind to get it out of thinking propositionally and to thinking in narrative. And I didn't want to I had a general outline, but I didn't want a firm point by point outline and just follow it. And I kind of let the story and the characters take me. And sometimes I would hit dead ends. And, oh, that's no good. Okay, scratch. Let's start over. Have more conversations. Now it took me. That's good. Okay. And so I learned how to do it that way. And then when I did a number of years later, the facilitator era, it was actually really, really fun to do it. It was still hard, but it wasn't hard like the first one, because now I started to learn how to think through story rather than thinking propositionally, writing out your nice little outline and following that down step by step. So that took me into that one. And then also with the teaching of Ep.4 then and how to study the Bible, it was like, okay, let's try this. A lot of my own background, right? From Dallas Bible College, which is closely connected to Dallas Theological Seminary. And so the oral, the grammatical, just historical approach is the way to go. Ep.4 thought that was kind of like ridiculous. What is he trying to do? And so I realized, and then I wanted to just let's focus it only on the story sections of Scripture, okay? And there's got to be a different approach, a different hermeneutic that will bring out the meaning and make it easy for these people to ask, or to ask, not to ask, but to actually implement. And so one of the questions I asked myself was, does everybody have to know grammar to be able to analyze Scripture? And I thought, no, that's crazy. Most people don't analyze your own grammar, and I think what the Ep.4 used to tell me when they would speak English, he said, English is so hard. It's so hard to speak. And Clay, it is so easy. We just speak it. You guys have grammar, and your grammar is so hard. We don't have grammar. We just speak our language. But that gives you the answer to, no, they don't study their own grammar. We don't study our own grammar. We just speak it, right? And so what if we focus not on analyzing the grammar, but analyzing the characters in the story? And we would use questions then to get us into what was going on in the dialogues and inside the minds of their conversations, or if they're having external conversations with other people or animals or spirit world or whatever. And let's analyze that through the characters rather than through grammar. Of course, that then opens the door up for anybody to be able to understand and interpret Scripture. It opens the door up to other things as well, multiple interpretations and that kind of thing. But it's something it's natural, it's doable, and it's something that you don't have to learn on the side of how to do. And in the book, we're not asking for a hostile takeover of hermeneutics. We're not asking for that. We're asking that to expand the playing field in hermeneutics, and that's all we're asking. So because every hermeneutic is coming at it from certain perspectives. So it's like looking in windows from a house from different parts of the house, right? You see different vistas, but so you get different analysis of what's going on in that house. But when we limit it to just that, the grammatical, historical, without adding the literary side to it, which actually came into being in the 1980s with Ryken and Longman and those guys, Ryken from Wheaton, and they actually made it so it was added. It was grammatical, historical, literary, and so we started to learn that Scripture is made up of different types of genre, and you just can't take one tool of analysis in hermeneutics and expect it to work on poetry and on narrative and on the propositional side of stuff. It doesn't work like that. And so they expanded our understanding. And so we're hoping now to come back. That was the 80s, all right? So 20 years later, we're trying to bring it back. And in between that time, though, there has been other works. What was it? What's his name there at Wheaton? I know. Walton and Sandy had the book, The Lost World of Scripture, and that came out in 2013. And Larry Caldwell came out with one in 2016 called Doing Bible Interpretation. He worked also in the Philippines, and he realized through his own practice as well that they don't, and he taught homiletics. So he realized that you can teach all these beautiful ways of doing homiletics, and then when the Filipinos went back to their home churches on the weekend, and they would go back into their traditional way of, here's the main point, and you go around in the circle and you hit the same point over and over again. And he would listen to them in the field or in their home churches, and he'd think, man, it's like, this is an organ. And so he started to realize there has to be a different way of approaching it. So I think he has another book in the making right now. So we're gonna see some books come out on that. But Longman and Riken, and back in that day in the 80s, said it's not just grammatical historical, it's got to be literary as well. And so now we're just trying to write that a little bit and see if we can take it further.
Yeah, we'll dig just a little more into the Return of Oral Hermeneutics, but you mentioned in that description of your own thinking, orality. Just want to touch on that briefly as a movement or a stream in missions. And we both know people and groups of people who throw their hands up in horror at the idea of orality. And I think perhaps it's because of some of the extremes that have been, some of the extreme statements that have been made, especially early on. So is it about abandoning text completely? You've already addressed this a little bit, but is it a Western imposition that threatens traditional cultural structures and social control to have any kind of text-based resources? I just wondered if you could comment on that, Tom.
Yeah. I think Scripture is written, so it's text. And so that component you shouldn't be trying to get rid of. That is there, and it's there for a purpose. And one thing it does is it remains there over years. And even though you have various translations of it and so forth, it still is there, and you have kind of ballpark meanings within boundaries of what this text means. What we're asking for is to recognize the oral nature of that text. That's one of the things that we have missed. Mm-hmm. And so one of the assumptions in our book is that you have to understand orality and its influence on how, well, number one, Scripture came first, in a sense, Scripture and spoken Scripture, right? In that sense, mm-hmm. The spoken word preceded the written word. And one of the things we argue in there is that spoken word by the prophets and so forth was just as inspired as what we consider the written word to be inspired. They're both inspired, but they're different because at that point it wasn't written. Later on, some of that would be written by different people. And so now it becomes, but what we forget when we move, we forget that that oral background that influenced the text. Once we moved right straight to the text, and we forgot that background and how that oral background influenced how it was. Even Paul, writing in the epistles, is writing not so much propositionally as he is through a dialogue in talking to these people, whoever they have, the Ephesians or whoever, about they're having a conversation, a dialogue going on about certain issues that these people are facing. We've forgotten all that. And when you start asking yourself, when you start thinking about the words of Scripture itself, hear, O Israel, that's like 400 times plus. Hear, O Israel. The ear, proclaim, announce. See, we hear those words, but because of our strong textual background, we miss the implications and the power and the emotional and imaginative aspects of those words. We just miss it. It's just, we don't see it. It's there. We see it, but we don't see it, And because we've focused on more of the ideas. And once we do that, if we focus on the ideas, those theological ideas now are going to de-platform, demystify, de-narrativize, de-event, de-everything of the scripture. And the chief character himself then becomes an idea rather than a person. Yeah. And so we have to get back and see, how has orality influenced the text? And we just haven't done that. And that then impacts hermeneutics, and it impacts everything, homiletics, right down the line.
Mm-hmm. So that's really what you're proposing in terms of orality, and some of those other things you'd see as perhaps extremes. One last thing on orality as a movement, if that's even the right term, but is there a hardwired connection, as some would suggest, between orality and rapid growth missiological models, a kind of a pragmatic approach to missions, and with the implication that text-based translation projects, creating resources that are text-based, is just too time-consuming, and it slows down the organic spread of the gospel and discipleship and church planning. Is that a hardwired connection between orality and those rapid pragmatic kind of movements, if you like?
I say we have that out there. And to me, some of that's really scary. Shatner, in his book, The Wheel Model, dissertation that he turned into a book, 2014, I think, is when it came out. And he analyzed around 20 different church growth movements in Southeast Asia, that area of the world, IMB and OM and some of those. And one of the things that was interesting in what he found was that they all say that, you have to have 4 generations, then that church planting movement is begun, 4 generations out. So you follow 2 Timothy 2:2. And what he found in the research was nobody had gone beyond 2 generations. Nobody had gone beyond that. Okay. So to analyze and say, this is what we should be doing, and we know this works, and they can't really say that until they've analyzed somebody who's actually done 4 generations. And that was in 2014. 2013, I think, was his dissertation, somewhere in that area. So that's not that long ago. And so the two have to, I think an oral approach to evangelism discipleship is a great way to go, but you have to connect it to the text, which is the biblical text. You want that there. And in some situations where, if you want the text, you better have it in your mind up here, because you better not be caught with the physical text. That's a different story. Mm-hmm. And we have to deal with that when we have to deal with that. But on the other occasions, when you don't, you want both of them there. That keeps the thing from just flying off wherever. And the church history is full of syncretism, and so we have to really, really guard that.
We'll be right back in just a moment, but first, here's a resource from AccessTruth. Looking for training resources for cross-cultural missions? Cross-Cultural Essentials is a 10-module curriculum with over 250 video-based tutorials covering 4 foundational areas. Cross-Cultural Essentials empowers believers to communicate in a new language and culture, tackle Acts-based principles for planting a church, and of course, understanding the overarching biblical narrative so they can confidently pass it on to people who may have never heard it before. Access the tutorials online today. Cross-Cultural Essentials, a comprehensive training curriculum for cross-cultural missions. And now, back to the AccessTruth Podcast with Paul Mack.
Well, let's turn a little bit more in depth to the return of oral hermeneutics. And by the way, I'm sure the irony isn't lost on you guys of a a 300-page text.
Don't tell
It's
them
somewhat
that.
academic. That's all about orality. I'm sure you guys have thought about that, but nonetheless, I found it a very readable text. I really enjoyed the book. But could you just give us a real quick overview of the flow of the thesis and how you developed the thoughts in the chapters, Tom?
Yeah. Our audience was basically, and probably should never do this, but we tried to do it. we'll see how successful we actually were. Was for the professional and the practitioner, because the professionals those are the teachers, the hermeneutic teachers in the Bible institutes, colleges, and seminaries, and they're the ones that influences the broad base of the church planters, the missionaries, whatever, and the pastors. And until they change, we're going to continue to perpetuate basically the same models that we're doing, that I used in Ep.4 that didn't work. And so we're going to just perpetuate that unless they change. And so, yeah, it is long, and it does have 2 Bible stories in it with a thing that took up a lot of pages too.
Yeah.
And it has 650 footnotes. Now, you don't have to read the footnotes, but the footnotes are there for those professionals to tell them that, hey, people have actually studied this stuff and know a lot about it, and we're blind to a lot of this stuff. And what do we need to know to expand our hermeneutic for 80% of the world who prefers to learn through oral methods? Okay, so that's an urban and a rural situation. It's not just rural. We think it's only rural. No, it's not. It's that today, 80% they're judging want to learn through they're oral preference learner. They want to learn in that capacity through videos, right? As we were talking earlier, and that type of thing. That's how they learn. My granddaughter, I doubt if she's read a book through probably since high school. I doubt if she's done that. How many videos does she watch? YouTube's, whatever, all kinds of them. And so that's what we have to get back to. That's why I said, write your books in story, which we did in this one. But we just put stories in. But we have to get back to that. So that was our audience. And if you don't want to read that, that's not there for you necessarily. Read to see how to do it, and then get into the other stuff and especially like once we get into character theology and that type of thing, which is going to be very easy to understand and grasp, and the questions and how to use the questions and that type of thing. So we actually divided the book then into 3 parts. So with a setting the stage, which was our intro, and then part 1 demonstrates. It's a demonstration. So we wanted to start the book with a story to show how we do it, rather than here's the propositions, now here's a story that illustrates what we just did. No, we wanted to start with a story, do it like we do it, and then now let's start pulling out the principles from it and build on those principles like that and lay them out. So we started with Elisha and the widow's oil story. Then the second chapter gets into the reflections on that story. And then that moves us to part 2, which now gets us into the propositions. And so one of the first things we looked at, and I'll just skim this at this point, and we can get detailed wherever you want to go. The chapter 3 gets into what's orality's influence on the text and teaching, a little bit what we were talking about before. Scripture was primarily oral before it ever was written. And so how did orality then influence how it was written, how it was delivered to the people in Colossae, Ephesus, wherever, or on the Sea of Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee? How was it delivered? And it gets into that. And from there, then we move into oral hermeneutics and what is it, start to define that and illustrate that, some of that from the story itself. Yeah. And then the 5th chapter is what we're saying is actually nothing new. It's new to a lot of people, but it's not new per se, because Hebrews did this for how long? they have multiple hermeneutics, but this was one of them. Oral hermeneutics was one of their hermeneutics. And so nothing new under the sun, as one wise man spoke one time. And from there, from Hebrew hermeneutics, then we take it back and we move it into character theology. So, which is a natural progression. So the characters now, rather than the propositions of justification by faith, if we take Romans 4, we talk about Abraham, we talk about David, and we let their lives demonstrate what justification is all about, justification by faith. So it moves from a concrete into the propositional side, justification by faith, and then you can bring it back to the concrete again. So it's just kind of the opposite in which way we have been taught how to do it, but it's much more what? It's much more natural. You take it from what you can, from the known to the unknown, and then you bring it back again to the known with added clarity, hopefully, and expansion and so forth. And then we move into the 7th chapter, which gets into the questions itself. And so the title is Questioning Our Questions. So, and we analyze, I mean, basically there's people use 6 or 8 questions, and that's what they use. And as we analyze the questions, many of them are content oriented. Many of them focus on the moral value of innocence and guilt. So it comes from a legal language. And we've forgotten that most people were in, and this includes the United States at this point, and I'm sure Australia, because of social media and other parts of the Western world, we think that honor shame is only for the Asian world and the Latin world and whatever, African. No, it's basically now, because of social media, it's permeated our culture, every culture basically at this point. And so we have to get, how do our questions get the honor shame perspective, which is relational language, in contrast to legal language, which is innocence and guilt. How do we get that in there? And we also look at fear power. So that's a control language. And we also get into purity and pollution, which is a language of cleansing in a sense, like what do you call that? You wash your hands and that kind of stuff. So we have terms for that. But so we try to get the value systems expanded beyond the legal system that comes from the West. And then we reflect on that chapter as well. And then we go into the final chapter again, or the final part, theory, and call it echoes. And now we talk about Elisha and the General Nahum story. And basically now, since you've been through it, to do that story again, another story, and then illustrate it starts to fall together much easier. Because now you've seen much more, you've worked through a lot of these, and now now you're looking for what's going to happen rather than what is going to happen, So trying to discover what's going to happen. Now you already know it, so now you're going to see it again. So it goes through it that way. So that's kind of where the summary of where we begin.
So, most of your previous writing, I think, would it be fair to say, has been aimed at the missions community.
Yeah.
And this book is as well, but I feel like while you're correct in saying that, others have, it's not like you're something you've come up with, and your extensive footnotes support that, but this way of doing hermeneutics is a challenge, right, to the established ways in the evangelical world. So maybe for those who don't read it but hear about it, maybe some who read it, but there'll be objections raised, and I don't know if you've been hearing those at all, but do we lose our moorings by doing this? And what happens to the body of work that's been done over the centuries in hermeneutics, but particularly in the last century or two? what happens with that? Is that thrown out and we start in some kind of inductive way back to square one every time?
Yeah. For the narrative sections of Scripture, we would say oral hermeneutics is where you start. So it should be first, but it's not necessarily the last word, but it should be the first word because it corresponds to the genre. And so once again, we're not asking for a hostile hermeneutic takeover. We think that we think that each brings something to the table. But one of the questions we would ask is our hermeneutic model accultural? It's not influenced by culture at all. No, because our approach to textual hermeneutics, the grammatical historical approach, is very much based out of the Enlightenment, out of the scientific world, and X plus X will always equal whatever that number happens to be. And so it tells us then that there is only going to be one meaning in the story of the prodigal son. Here is the author's one meaning. And this will get you to that one meaning. And orality says, you know what? There actually may be multiple meanings. And all still within the boundaries of that story. And they'll say, well, you can't do that but what we don't understand is that the story itself has structure. And that structure helps provide guardrails and guide rails as to how to interpret that. And when you go outside those boundaries, then it's going to be skewed. But because we don't understand orality, we don't understand how those structures help control that story and put boundaries to it. We actually, and because it's orality, we call it boundary fluidity. So it's really mushy, right? And the scientific world doesn't like mush. But that's a cultural model of hermeneutics. And just as oral hermeneutics is a cultural model, it allows for much more mushiness in there. But it's once again boundaried fluidity. We put a bunch of the words like that in the book, and I actually took some from Van Hooser, two of his, which were quite interesting, to show that. But see, once again, if you don't understand orality, it says, well, then it's open for anything. No, it's not. The story is not open for any meaning.
And one of the biggest picture, the widest picture, those guardrails, I would suggest, is the meta-narrative itself. That this incident, this story, fits within the larger story of who God is. And I just pulled out one quote that struck me from the book that it's talking about orality focuses on the unified whole, the global, the big picture. The oral mind totalizes. The parts are not excluded, but rather seen as nested in the whole from which they originated, originate, more inductive. In contrast, much of modern methodology starts with the dissected parts and then deducts. And I think that's a critical issue, that's the biggest and most significant guardrail is the whole story.
Yeah.
And we fit it within that, right?
Yeah. So to interpret a story, you have to interpret within that story. And then the stories that surround it in the same book, if it's Matthew or whatever.
Yeah.
And then those stories that surround Acts and goes backwards into the Old Testament. And then once again, that meta-narrative is so central to keeping this thing under control. That is so central. And that's one of the things that we've not really been taught well on what is the meta-narrative of Scripture. I mean, one of actually a couple of classes that I do, one of the assignments is give me the meta narrative of Scripture in 2 to 4 sentences. And they kind of look like, huh? But that actually becomes your hermeneutic, whether you know it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you need to actually write it down. So it really forces you to be precise on how you see it. And once you do that, it starts to, wow, okay, that's my boundaries right there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think to that leads, Tom, I'd suggest to another question that could come out of what you've been writing and others, so where's the role of the teacher, preacher, teacher, the gifted teacher within all of this? Is it just a totally democratized process where everyone's voice has equal value? And would you agree that the guide in a given oral Bible teaching session, then the authority or the reason why someone can be a guide is because they are more like they've gone ahead in that meta narrative, and so they're simply reminding and asking questions and leading people to understand that within the whole. Would that be accurate to say?
That's precisely what it is, because you, number one, have that meta narrative, and you can bring it down into this one Bible story, and you can keep asking the questions that keep it focused so that they'll understand why are those characters operating as they're operating, and what are the implications of the doctrines, the values, the whatever principles, leadership principles, or whatever that are coming out of that. That's the teacher's role, to keep them focused and expanding their understanding of that text. But in that background is that meta narrative, and they don't have that.
Yeah.
That's the teacher's role, to make sure that they actually get that later on, and not just this one story, but be able to take those and expand those out so that they actually will have that meta narrative as well, and actually be able to articulate it. That's not just have it, but being able to articulate that, and that becomes your oral hermeneutic that controls everything else.
Yeah. So we probably need to finish up, but I was wondering, what are some of the practical applications for in all of this for a cross-cultural discipler? Like, what does it come down to in actual practice? And say a pastor in the USA or Australia, how should these things impact their roles, their ministries?
Wow. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. One of the things I say that if I was a pastor, number one, and I taught in this church building, and I had a building actually, I would have some artist in the church, or somebody, if they don't have it, get an artist and have them put up the Bibles, paint the Bible stories around the church on the top there. And every time I preach, I say, here we are in the story right over here. And so pretty soon people start to understand. And then and also I think that's where you teach a meta narrative once a year that goes from Genesis to Revelation on a Sunday morning, that gives them that big picture once a year at least.
Yeah.
And now you can just walk around those stories. Here we are, just go right around the story, right? And then, but during the other weeks, here we are in this story over here. This is where it fits into the big story. So you're constantly telling them how to do that. And once again, I would emphasize, what questions do you ask? Focus on the characters, focus on the conversations, focus on the choices that are made. Who was shamed in this? Who was honored in this? Those type of questions like that, to keep them focused on trying to use character theology or analysis, or I should say theologizing through characters, so that we come up with theology of characters, which is, here's the doctrines that these people are trying to teach us about. Here are the values that we need to learn from their actions, or appropriate or inappropriate, that type of thing. So, it's a big chore.
Well, I think those things are very practical, and I've always felt as if something is relevant for cross-cultural ministry, for missions, whether it's the most remote areas in a city somewhere with needy groups, then it's relevant in the U.S. and Australia and Europe as well. Those principles should apply across the board, right? So, yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, Tom. We really appreciate your time, and it's been fascinating to talk with you. And appreciate your ministry and the things you've been writing and saying. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for the opportunity.